Hi, this is Austin Wintory, and this is the Game Maker's Notebook. Today, I am talking with Nainita Desai, the composer of Sam Barlow's two most recent games, Immortality and Telling Lies. She's a relative newcomer to games, and you'll see in the conversation why I put that in quotes. But her last two games have both been just striking in their originality and personality, and she's brought a lot to them in her collaboration with Sam. She has this wonderful kind of polymath and cultural melting pot of a background in childhood that we get into, and just generally was overflowing with insights as I grilled her on her process, and particularly in tackling these two very unique games. So I had a really wonderful time chatting with her, and I hope you enjoy it. All right, Nainita, thank you for doing this.
Thank you for having me. It's lovely to see you again.
Yeah, likewise. Yeah, sadly missed you. You were at Ghent, if I understand correctly.
I was indeed. Had a wonderful time in Ghent with our fellow composer buddies and industry folk, and it was great. A couple of great concerts, actually. The Korean concert was very out there, very wacky. I loved it. It's good fun.
You do, yes. I think your love of all things wacky shows up in your writing. We will undoubtedly get into that a bit later. But obviously this show being centered around game development more broadly, and our chat, of course, game music more specifically, it's nice that Ghent, the World Soundtrack Awards, is starting to gradually crack the seal open in the direction of games. I know that they don't currently, unless I somehow didn't hear about it this year, they don't currently do an award for game music, but they have kind of shown, each year kind of progressively more interest in game music after many years of supporting film and TV very steadfastly, and like documentaries and all the rest of it in ways that many others don't.
Yeah, no, one step closer. And I did air my opinions as well about games music for Ghent. And it's something that I know is in very serious development. So that's, I think there's some exciting developments for next year at the very least. So maybe we'll see you.
What a shock. Yeah, well, I think, fingers crossed. I am utterly not shocked that you were airing your opinions. As someone who immediately makes the impression of not holding back one's thoughts. I mean, in the best way. So, tell you what. Let's. One thing I actually don't know, as much as I've been able to enjoy chatting with you here and there over the last few years, and really kind of getting an insight into your process and the wonderful kind of consistently unique nature of what you do. One thing I don't actually really know is where it all started for you. You know, I've always delighted in the fact that composers' origin stories are so different. That, you know, one person met that perfect teacher at the right moment, another just picked up a dusty instrument they found in a grandparent's attic, all that kind of thing. There's 1,000 variations across 1,000 composers. Where did you start? What age? What kind of got you into it? I don't actually know the answer to this.
Well, no, good question. I mean, and also being able to self-reflect. I'm not the kind of person that dwells on the past. I'm always constantly pushing forward, looking to the future. I find it kind of depressing looking at the past all the time. But sometimes I think it's interesting, you know, to reflect. So for me, I guess, you know, it's funny because I got this funny award last year called the Discovery of the Year Award at Ghent. Go to Ghent again. And I thought, I'm an overnight success, which took sort of 30 years.
Yeah.
and
I remember the exact same thing happening to Jeff Beal when House of Cards exploded, and everybody went, wow, who's this Jeff Beal guy? And meanwhile, he'd been consistently working in TV and had won Emmys and all kinds of things for like in excess of 20 years before that.
I know.
But it invariably happens.
Yeah. I'm a huge fan of Jeff Beal, by the way, and House of Cards. I got to meet him in New York about 5-6 weeks ago. So I was waxing lyrical about his score. But for me, where I started, he's great. He's an amazing composer and trumpet player. In terms of being sort of like discovery or breakthrough, my career has been nothing but a series of constant breakthroughs. I'm always just sort of breaking through. And so I broke through at the age of 5 or 6 when I started to learn the piano and the violin. And I was very fortunate in that I had free music lessons. Something we just do not have anymore in the UK in our primary and secondary educational system. So I was in the school orchestra at the age of 8 playing violin and scratching away badly.
Was this at the behest of your parents? Like, what prompted that initial, I guess I'll try these instruments?
Well, no, I mean, it was like every child was given the option to play a musical instrument and have free lessons. So I thought, okay, I'll play the violin. That's what was thrust upon me, and the piano. And I didn't have a piano at home. So I went to a Church of England school during the day, Monday to Friday. I was at a Church of England school. So I was in school choirs. I went to church and sang in school in choirs and Latin and gospel and pop choirs, and so I wanted to be a singer at the age of 8. I wanted to inhabit Barbra Streisand and be I love musical theatre. I used to go to as a young teenager. There's this famous bookshop called Foyles on Charing Cross Road, and I used to walk up, spend my allowance, sort of taking the train up to Foyle's bookshop, going to the 4th floor and pouring through musical theatre, songbooks and discovering Sondheim and I
was going to ask if you had any favorites from that time.
Oh, well, I mean, I was a big fan of Sondheim musicals, and of course Barbra Streisand was my way into musicals. With Hello Dolly, Yentl. Big fan of Yentl, and Michel Legrand and Alan and Marilyn Bergman, and that's what introduced one of the introductions I had to film music through song in film. And then, going back, learning the violin and the piano at school and singing at the weekend. I was brought up. I'm a second generation British Asian, so I had to go to the Hindu temple. So I had a very eclectic musical background, and I was then forced actually to learn the sitar and the tablas to embrace my Indian heritage, which I really rebelled against. I really pushed back against that. I hated playing the sitar because my guru insisted that I had this really strict discipline regime of never progressing beyond scales. Even for the first 6 months of learning the instrument, I had to play the scales, and
supremely classical education.
And very rigid and very formal. And my hand had to be placed in a certain way. The fingers would be bent in a certain way, and if I didn't do it correctly, I'd be wrapped across the knuckles, and my fingers would be bleeding with the steel strings of the instrument. But I did learn. I did take up the tablas, which I really, really loved. I'm a big sucker for rhythm and unusual meters and time signatures, and that's so that's something that stayed with me. It was a big it's something that I really, really loved, sort of learning the tablas, and it was a very male instrument to learn. It was very physical and quite physically demanding, playing the tablas and getting tones out of it, requires a lot of pressure. So, and it was a very
It's also probably pretty phenomenal ear training. I remember once dabbling in ragas, sort of the traditionally structured ragas and sort of broad Indian classical music for a little HBO short film I did like 15 years ago. It was a very early project. And I remember I hired a bunch of Indian musicians and to kind of just teach me the basic ins and outs as much as I could in a short span. And I remember I was using a sample of tablas, and I remember the singer, I hired this wonderful singer, and she came in and she listened to the track and she goes, "These are pitched wrong." She said, who played these? And I was very embarrassed. I said, well, actually, that was part of the one budget item I couldn't reach to. I had to use samples. And she was like, but they're literally the wrong pitch for what this kind of music is. Yeah. And it blew my mind because I remember thinking, wow, the nuance that is grilled into you to perceive and to react to within this tradition. It was a very eye-opening experience to me of just how much these instruments, even percussion, which we think of as non-pitched in the West broadly, other than, obvious exceptions, mallets and that kind of thing. Yes. We think of it as non-pitched, and in the Indian, at least this particular Indian tradition, it was like, no. They're borderline a melody instrument in their own right.
Yeah. No, I mean, I know one of my musical heroes was Zakir Hussain, who played. He's a legend in his own time, in his own lifetime, and I think he played with people like Paco de Lucia and Shankar and. There was a whole sort of Vinu Vinayakram who plays the guttam, which is this clay pot. And he's got this little Indian man from South India who has this big pot belly, and he sits playing this pot instrument made of clay. And I used to go to the South Bank, and John McLaughlin on guitar, Vinu Vinayakram, Shankar on violin. These were it was the heyday of Indian jazz improvisation, and it's really lovely to see. I recently discovered the Berkeley Indian Ensemble. I think they have a huge following on social media, and it's a group of musicians who are at Berkeley, and they're all playing the South Asian sort of discipline, South Indian classical music, and they are phenomenal to watch and to play. So I'm digressing.
But this is all deeply. I mean, this kind of melting pot of influences. The kind of British and or Western, generally kind of classical education mixing with this kind of I love the begrudging sort of honoring of one's heritage is a very funny it's a very classic sort of child perspective where there's a thing, it's sort of like being told to eat your vegetables, where there's something that you're told you should do this, and as a kid you think, this is stupid. I don't want it. None of my friends are into this or whatever. And then as an adult, you're like, thank God I got that, that's so valuable to me now.
I know. And I kind of regret not pursuing it further, certainly on the sitar, because I could make a killing as a session musician now. But as a teenager, I then discovered film. Film was my big escape, and my earliest memories of film was actually I was on holiday on the Isle of Wight. It was a rainy Saturday afternoon, and I was 5 years old, and it was pouring with rain, and so my parents piled me into a cinema, and we watched The Aristocrats, and again, those Disney musicals, and that sort of Seven Brides for Seven Sisters and brothers, and all all those movies, those animations, Bedknobs and Broomsticks and Mary Poppins and so on. They formed a huge part of my really young childhood, and then developing into going to the local library. There was a library which they had a soundtrack department, and you could go in and rent vinyl LPs, soundtracks. So I would, once every 2 weeks, I would go to my local library and hire out, rent LPs like The Sea of Love, the film with Al Pacino and John Barry, and the first album that my parents ever bought for for our new record player was Ennio Morricone's The Good, the Bad and the Ugly. So that introduced me to so many different types of, the inventiveness and I just thought, what is this amazing sound that I'm hearing? I don't know the movies, but I certainly picked up on the sounds. And then, I used to noodle all the time, as I was learning instruments. I would never learn the pieces that were given to me for the lesson. I would just play and make up my own tunes. And that I discovered.
That's so funny. We're so similar in that way. That was exactly the way I started too. Just I was like a bad student, basically, who refused to learn what I was being taught because it was more interesting to start generating variations and, give it its own spin.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And if I watched TV, and then growing up through the golden age of, there's always a golden age, isn't there? For me, the golden age was, in the 80s, growing up listening to TV theme tunes was such a big thing in those days, like the A-Team.
The Mike Post era. Yeah, exactly.
Yes, Mike Post, Knight Rider and the A-Team and all those great melodies and great show, tunes that, I'd be in the kitchen and my favorite show would come on. We have children's TV. There was a golden age of children's TV in the UK where we had shows like Grange Hill and Blue Peter and Rhubarb and Custard and all these kids TV shows, which they were just fantastic theme tunes. So that perked up my mind to, what is this? It's really resonating with me. And then growing up with film as a teenager, and then I think the first films that really, so I got to university, I did a degree in mathematics because I wasn't allowed through various rules and British educational system rules. I couldn't go and study music. They wouldn't allow me to, even though, so music was always a part of my life in a big way, but I was under various pressures to go in.
This was like the official rule. Like, this wasn't your parents. You're saying this was like an academically enforced rule?
Yeah. So I didn't take the right subjects at school to go and do an A level in music and then go and do a degree.
I see. Yeah. So it's one of those where you would have had to make different decisions at an earlier juncture in life, basically.
Yeah, even though I wanted to, we didn't have those options in school as a teenager. So I ended up.
Isn't that so fascinating to put that burden on kids to make these decisions?
I think that's one of the huge problems, the pressures on kids' education these days of forcing you to make a decision, a life-changing decision at the age of 15 or 14 or 15, where you don't know what you want to do at that age. I mean, not everyone does. So,
the majority don't. I mean, even like there's so many examples of people that they don't know what they want, and like you disadvantage those that are that sort of know what they want, and those that just need to cross paths with the thing. They need to try a bunch of stuff, and then somewhere at an unpredictable moment, they'll land on that thing that lights the fire. You kind of, it's weird how it seems to disadvantage both groups. It's an odd policy to I get, I get having rigorous standards and all that. I'm certainly supportive of that. But the idea that you literally closed the door, and mathematics of all things, is quite. I mean, obviously, there's those arguments that it's not so far afield of the arts as some might suggest, and I'm definitely sympathetic to that idea. But still, everything about your story up to this point has been musical theater and Barbra Streisand and film and Ennio Morricone and all that. And of all the options you had, how did you choose math?
Well, I mean, it's something that I was under pressure to, a lot of peer pressure and parental pressure. You can't, what is music? I didn't even know that being a composer was something that I could make a career out of. It wasn't an option. It wasn't on my radar. It was just I wanted to be a pop singer. I was really into technology. So I loved, I had this little portable cassette Walkman, Sony Walkman. And I used to go around recording sound effects and just recording the environment around me. And I used to go on holiday, and I'd always have a pair of headphones and a microphone and be recording stuff. And just cataloging it, and then making my own mixtapes and recording the top 40 and listening to film scores. And then I heard Peter Gabriel, his score for The Last Temptation of Christ, and that blew my mind at the time. And then I discovered Daniel Lenoir, and he and Brian Eno had this really interesting working relationship where Brian Eno was incredibly cerebral, and Daniel Lenoir is very earthy, and he was producing, I think, between the two of them or on his own, I think, he produced U2 and Emmylou Harris and the Neville Brothers and Bob Dylan and an incredible array of artists at that time. And so my ears and eyes opened up to the world of record producing. So I thought, I want to be a record producer. I want to be a music engineer. So that's one of the reasons. Well, I took maths because I was good at math. It just happened to be something that I enjoyed, and I love the beauty of numbers, and I was interested in programming, so I learned Pascal and COBOL and Fortran 77 and BASIC. And
yeah, wow.
so I got into programming and coding, and then I discovered video games as a teenager as well. I had an Amstrad PC, and I would play little video games. And the first games console I had I couldn't afford it, actually. My best friend was quite well off, and she had the Atari console. She got given an Atari console, and so I used to go around to her house and play Space Invaders, and and so that was my introduction to video games, and then getting into programming as well. And so when I left, when I actually went into the industry, as a in my early 20s, I actually wanted to create, because I got work as a sound designer, and I went into sound design because of my love of technology. So I was doing dialogue editing, Foley editing. I was a Foley artist in Germany, working on American imported TV shows like Columbo and Ironside. I don't know if you remember Ironside, the detective in the wheelchair. And I had this leather suitcase with a creaky handle that so every time he would wheel his squeaky wheelchair, I would wheel this suitcase, and watch it on screen. And so that was my early days of synchronization in sync, and so that was fun. So
it's funny how that really shows where it's interesting, all these different threads that we'll talk about your collaborations with Sam in a minute, but it is interesting how so much of what you're saying does feel like you, despite your truly prolific career and wonderful successes so far in film and TV, and especially just the way in which you have taken the art of documentary scoring so seriously and really done such wonderful scores, very cinematic and kind of narratively insightful work, and not just the kind of classic wallpaper, just give it a bed while the talking heads go. You've really kind of sidestepped the trappings of that genre and done such amazing work. And yet I say all that as like, despite all of that, this confluence of technology, production, and also the raw kind of just musicality and musicianship does seem to have put you on a kind of inevitable collision course with games. Because I think one of the fundamental things that composers new to games struggle with is an understanding of systems. The idea that there's a logic that's driving this music. It's not just, it starts here and it ends here in the way that a concert piece or obviously a music to linear footage works. But the idea that even if it's a linear piece that's being triggered under some set of conditions where the music itself is fundamentally linear, but we need X, Y, and Z variable to all trigger before this piece is sort of eligible to be brought to the fore for the player. Even just understanding a system as rudimentary as that, never mind real-time dynamic mixing or branching pathways or whatever the case, is a thing that is kind of mystifying, I think, for a lot of composers new to games. I often see it kind of kicking and screaming, like, can't I basically just write film music and let the game people figure out how to do it? And I hadn't really, part of why I was excited for this conversation is despite our prior chats and opportunities at hanging out and Comic-Con and all those other things that we've done, I hadn't realized that your background would give you such a great insight into system. When you say the beauty of numbers, I mean, what is video game design if not literally that sentence? And that's such a great. I really didn't appreciate that about your background. I didn't know that.
Yeah, no, I mean, I very much throughout everything, the way I approach music composition, there's chaos and order. And I love the structure and the order. I have to create a very ordered framework in which I work on every level, from the order of my desktop to my surroundings to the way I organize myself with spreadsheets and so on, that kind of organization, down to musical organization. And I like that discipline because then you have that structure and you have that framework and the way that you're structuring your down to the pieces of music, within the game. And then you allow for that chaos to happen, that creativity. And I think there's a place for both. And that's what I enjoy, as opposed to just writing music for the hell of it. I need some kind of framework. I need a brief, but also within that, I need, that framework that games music allows you is such a intellectually superior sort of way to compose, in terms of, as opposed to just writing exploring and expressing yourself creatively to the narrative of a linear composition. For film and TV, it's all about the storytelling and the and just creating and being creatively expressive. Whereas with games, there's so much more to it that I think that can throw composers. And I think even if you disregard the technical constraints, you still need to understand it to be able to be totally immersed in how to effectively tell the story in a non-linear way through music. It's so much more challenging, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. So let's kind of jump into that then, because obviously I would love to plumb the depths of your film and TV background, but this being the Game Maker's Notebook, I will resist the temptation and I will plug my own YouTube video in which you give some great answers and insights into that on the series that we did earlier this year. Anyway, you told many great stories, not least of which was the documentary musical, which is a thing I still think about all the time, and just the crazy conditions under which you had to do that. So, dear listener, you are encouraged to go seek out that conversation. But so I first came across your work in games, obviously from Telling Lies, your collaboration with Sam. Was that in fact your first game, or is there something before that that I just somehow am unaware of?
Well, in many ways, it's my first game, because I started off in games about over 20 years ago, and it was such a different industry then. But I started off doing sound effects. I did it for a couple of years. I worked for a major games publisher called Empire Interactive in the UK, and they had 6 or 7 developers underneath them making games for them in many different genres, like flight simulators and I did the music and sound effects for Monopoly, World Cup Monopoly, and and Sheep, which was, I think, PlayStation 1. I think, going back, but then my career digressed and I moved into film and TV because the publisher then sold up, the developers went out of business. So my career in games came to an actual end, a sort of a natural end that didn't progress further. So then coming back 20 years later to Telling Lies, I got approached by Sam totally out of the blue. And I think because of my experience of having then scored linear and film and TV, he sort of opened up. I don't know why he contacted me. There's something that...
Yes, you don't know, he didn't like see something of yours on TV or watch a film you'd scored or something?
Yeah, I think he heard something of mine. I think it was a documentary score that I wrote about a serial killer, and Swedish sort of noir serial killer, The Confessions of Thomas Quick. And he heard something in that he really liked and thought...
he's definitely a cinephile. Like I mean, you certainly see that with Immortality, but even just when I first, in the wake of her story coming out, I was so blown away by that game, and sought him out. I thought, I just want to be friends with someone this talented. Like, this is just a cool, interesting guy. And one thing that impressed me was that he seemed to really, while he lived and breathed games, he had a real deep knowledge and appreciation for cinema as an art. I mean, it was beyond, I watched Star Wars as a kid. I mean, it was like, this guy really seems to know the body of work of film. So it doesn't, I guess, surprise me that he would have a kind of a above average spidey sense in picking up something, and especially in a documentary. Typically, this is just not a normal kind of entry point, but it makes perfect sense, both for you, given like I said before, the passion with which you have scored documentaries, and his passion for paying attention, I think. Of course, that makes total sense. I should have guessed.
Yeah, no, I mean, I went to the National Film and Television School and studied sound for film after my degree in math. So I am a cinephile as well. And I love film more than anything, actually. Music is kind of a hangover sideline to my actual love of film. And so that's how our conversation started, really. And I think he didn't want a composer that was used to scoring games with that experience. He wanted someone with the aesthetic and the sort of the experience of scoring linear and film and TV. So we would have, Sam likes, I'm a very visually inspired composer. I like to have visuals in front of me. It speaks volumes to me. And with games, even as a traditional way of scoring games, you're given examples of storyboards or, images of characters or examples of gameplay, early revisions, early drafts and you're working with the narrative designers. I'm scoring a game at the moment, which is a much more traditional approach to scoring games. And working with Sam is so innovative and different. It's quite scary because we're finding and forming our own methodology and ways of how we're going to create the music for this. We've got, with Immortality, we've got 8 to 10 hours worth of footage. And of course it's an interactive film trilogy, so it's about 3 films. I couldn't possibly score 3 movies.
No, it wouldn't even make sense. Best case scenario is it would read within the kind of diegetic. It's a weird to refer to it as diegetic, but it's oddly applicable in this case to say the diegetically within the clips, even though I, as a player, exist outside the clips. I'm not in it the way an audience member is in the movie, as it were, where I'm very knowingly outside of it. And it's interesting in Immortality how that relationship between you and the content that's been an evolutionary thing with his games. But obviously her story, one of the things that blew me away about just the art of narrative in her story was the way that you didn't even know for half the game who, quote, you are. You don't know why you're looking at these clips. You're just kind of intrinsically motivated because it's interesting. But the narrative of kind of what's the point of all this hasn't even been revealed yet. And similarly, in Telling Lies, I really loved that game. I think the thing that I loved the most about Telling Lies, funny enough, I've always been fascinated by all the little things that actors do that are not the big Al Pacino speech moments, but the little moments in between. I'm sure it's similar with you, where when you're scoring a film and there's 2 characters talking, it's the one who's listening I invariably find myself kind of obsessing over. Yeah. And I loved in Telling Lies when you would land on a clip that's 8 minutes, of which 6 minutes is the person listening to whoever's talking. Yes. So it's just footage of watching someone react without knowing what is being said to them. I remember thinking that was one of the most amazing ways to try and tell a story, where you go, what did that person just say? You know, where there's a minute of kind of pensive look and then, where you just go, oh, something happened. And it's like, it engages with a form of narrative. He's such an innovative storyteller. But I remember at the time wondering, how on earth do you even begin to conceptualize music for a thing like this? Because you're not scoring what you're looking at. It's like you're trying to score. Okay, well, actually, you tell me if this is correct. Mm-hmm. It feels like you're trying to score a perception of the intention of the player. It's like, what is the player looking for, or what are they projecting, or what are they on the hunt for from this footage, and how do we sort of support that experience? It feels like it's almost there as a gateway between the footage and the player's experience navigating the footage. That's kind of how it comes across to me. But I'm curious how you even begin in the case of either of the two games with Sam.
That's very complicated. That's above my head, above my station. I mean, what we did was we distilled. Okay, we thought. I mean, with Telling Lies, we've got 4 main characters. And so I wrote a theme for each character, basically. Immortality is different in that we have one character, Marissa Marcel. But I mean, with Telling Lies, we had 3 themes. We had control, trust, and intimacy. And so, you know, I think the best analogy I can make is imagine, you know, when someone dies, you have their obituary is summed up, you know, their life is summed up in 150 words and posted as an obituary in a newspaper, local paper. And so with Immortality, for example, or even Telling Lies, I'm having to sum up this concept in one single musical theme, which is an overarching concept. It's so big. It's, you know, it's incredibly, with Immortality, it's very philosophical and life encompassing. So how do I achieve that in one 7-minute piece of music? So that was one of the big challenges with Immortality. You know, you've got 3 films, and we tried initially. We'd have long discussions, and that's what I love about Sam. He's one of the brightest human beings I've ever come across, you know, let alone worked with.
Yeah.
He knows everything about everything, but I mean, has an opinion about everything, but his insight into the human condition is just fantastic. And it's very inspiring for me, just listening to someone talking. You know, the best directors I've worked with are the ones that just I listen to and I soak up the vibe of what they're trying to explain. What is the essence of this game? What is the essence of what we're trying to convey? And then by listening to them, I'm already hearing music, or I'm already hearing a sound palette, or, you know, that I find very inspiring.
Totally.
Sam, I didn't actually get any visuals. I got a huge script that I must admit I read half of, and then I put it down. And then
I mean, for 8 hours of footage, it must have been like hundreds of pages.
Hundreds of pages. And so in the end, I just said, okay, we would share Spotify playlists. We would share music. We would share movies. And it's interesting because I kind of knew that I'd hit the nail on the head sometimes when Sam would describe something to me, and then I'd go off on a tangent and say, have you seen The Eyes of Laura Mars with Faye Dunaway? And he said, that's exactly what I'm talking about, you know. And if we would be singing from the same hymn sheet. And that was really, you know, just like, for example, one of the movies. So I wrote 3 themes for Immortality, and each theme is it's not about the movies. It's about the character Marissa's journey and how she grapples with mortality. So we're looking at these 3 abstract philosophical themes. One is life. Okay, it was on the soundtrack. It's called Life, but it's about living in the moment. It's about so the film is this 1970s New York City set thriller, and and I'd have these conversations with Sam, and he would say, okay, it's called Minsky. It's a 1970s thriller. It's about the death of a famous artist, and it's about living in the moment. It's about engaging in the pleasures, physical pleasures of life, and capturing that in a bottle. And it's very sensual. And Sam would come up with these analogies that instantly gave me this visual image. He said, imagine Jesus living physically amongst us and hanging out with real folk drinking wine. Okay. And so I said, yeah, okay, I can see that. I can see that at the Last Supper, him having a good old jolly with his mates and getting drunk and being hedonistic. And then, and the music had to have this sense of abandonment where we revel in the beauty and we get wrapped up in hedonistic activities. And then, so that would be the main theme for each film. And then we'd throw a twist, just like we did with Telling Lies. We'd have a subverted theme. And the subverted version of the main theme in life is, it reflects, you wake up the next morning and you've got a bad hangover. And
right. The consequence of the hedonism.
Consequence, yes. And so it's like the subverted version then would be hollowed out and slightly dark, and it's like, yeah. So what feels free and natural feels contrived and artificial in the subverted version. And
so on that, before we, because this is phenomenal, and I love hearing this, and I don't want to shortchange your comparable description of the other two sort of buckets of material that you had to contend with the other two films. But just to jump on this specifically, so you've got these two kind of thematic it's kind of like two sides of the same coin. It's sort of the action and the reaction in a sense, or the action and the consequence. And how in practice did you, because it doesn't come across like it's basically just here's piece number one and here's piece number two when you play the game. How did you then say, okay, what do we do with these? Like because I haven't played every last minute of the game. One of the things I find so fascinating about his games is how you don't have to kind of platinum them, as it were, to really kind of grasp them, which I think is a fascinating design discussion in its own right. And so, but the result is I haven't been able to kind of see all the different ways in which the music might interact with the different footage. So kind of, what is that interaction? How are you breaking that down? And for example, take just the main theme, the sort of good version, as it were, the Jesus enjoying 1970s hedonism, the consequence-free version. Are you making a bunch of variations on that? Are you breaking it down? How is it actually literally being deployed such that player does X and that's how I'll hear that?
Well, I didn't, I'm one of those in this instance, I was the composer that didn't have to worry about the implementation so much.
But even in terms of just what you were expected to deliver, because obviously I want to talk also, help me remember to that end. I do want to get into your collaboration with Rob Ames and all of that as well, because that's endlessly fascinating to me as part of this process. But yeah, just in terms of is it just the one piece of music? Or did you have to sort of provide a bunch of variations, or was it deeply stemmed, that kind of thing? Yeah.
So yes, I mean, it was modular, there are chunks and segments, whatever way you want to describe it. But we distilled it down to, we tried to make something that was very, potentially huge, and distilled it down to its core fundamental requirements. In that I wrote a theme for each movie, had a theme. We didn't want to make a nod to film genres because of the non-linear aspect of the playing. You're dipping in and out of any of the three movies at any particular time from scene to scene. So you could be going backwards and forwards decades, from 1968 to the 70s to the early 90s. So it didn't make sense to do that. So I came up with the idea of this.
Were you tempted? Just real sorry to interrupt you, but that was one of the things I immediately thought of. That you make a very clear declaration that you are not fictionalizing, like you're not transporting yourself to the 70s and being the composer of those films.
No.
The film is very clearly not trying to do that. And I was curious if you ever contemplated that or if you tried it.
Yes, yeah, we did.
I would think it would be very tempting.
Yeah, no, I mean, as a film buff, you know, as a cinephile, it's something, particularly with the 70s set noir crime thrillers, I was really interested. I mean, I was very inspired by Basic Instinct and Jerry Goldsmith and Body Double, Brian De Palma's Body Double, and then going
Body Heat, the John Barry. There's a sensuality.
Why do you say that, Austin? Because there's a little essence of that. A little essence of Body Heat, and also what's the film with Sharon Stone and Sylvester Stallone that John Barry scored? It's another modern sort of old noir crime classic.
It's on the tip of my tongue. I know the one you're talking about.
Yeah, I'll remember it by the end of this conversation.
Yeah, exactly. I lose my mind. That's why I keep the IMDb app on my phone.
Yeah. But there is an essence of that John Barry-esque use of melody in life. In The Eyes of Laura Mars, I mean, I love, of course, because the song in Eyes of Laura Mars was sung by Barbra Streisand. So I was introduced, and I'm a big fan of Faye Dunaway. So there are all these sort of spider web of connections through film history. So I would write 1 7-minute piece of music, and I would say 4 chunks of it are the main theme, and then I would write different chunks, which would be the subverted theme, the sort of the
specialist.
The specialist. I knew it began with the letter S. That's right. Yeah.
Yes, it was going to drive me crazy. Sorry, but yes, but okay, continue.
Great score, by the way. So musically, we did discuss the idea of playing homage to these movies, you know, that inspired both of us so very much, and we would share Spotify playlists of music that inspired us, but we decided not to do that in the end for practical, logistical reasons, and to create this overarching feel, you know, with slightly extended techniques with strings, orchestral, organic, acoustic, raw, and Sam and myself, we always want to veer away from musical convention. So one of the other themes is religion, and for this gothic novel called The Monk, the 1968 film Ambrosia, one of the other films in the game. And what do you think of when you think of religion musically? Choirs, angelic choirs. And I thought, no, please don't let me. I don't want to go down that route. But actually,
organ chorales and
but we did. I mean, I did integrate voice and, you know, the choir into that piece, because it had to have this slightly fantastical sprinkling of magic within the theme, with what it represented within the game, within that particular film. So I'd use, you know, little touches of saxophone for the noir New York 70s thriller. You know, I've always looked for an excuse to use the sax, and I've never had that opportunity. And so narratively, everything sort of connects loosely. I'm just picking up I'm trying to imbue the essence, the spirit of each of the movies without making a nod to each film genre in such an explicit way. So that with the harmonic progression, the harmonic sequences, sometimes you go, there's something slightly old-fashioned about this, you know, that maybe inspired by All the President's Men with Robert Redford, or Network with Faye Dunaway. You know, that kind of the scores that I would listen to, The Conversation with Ford Coppola. You know, those kinds.
Shire.
Yeah. I'm, you know, a huge fan of those. There are certain themes through cinematic history in scores that have haunted me my whole life, like David Shire's piano in The Conversation, and somehow John Barry, you know, and you know, and so on. So they found themselves, they imbued themselves in the DNA of the fabric of some of the harmonic sequences, not consciously. I would never do it consciously, but always subconsciously they'd find a way out. And then another touchstone for Sam and myself was David Lynch. he's all, and that happened in Telling Lies, and he's a kind of a running narrative theme through both the games that we've worked on, and that duality, and that you get that with the main theme and the subverted theme, but also the supernatural theme. And I think that was the biggest musical challenge, was to create these the main theme, and then when the player is depending on the tagging and the metadata and how they tagged each scene in terms of dramatic intensity, you're onto something when you start hearing the music warping and contorting, and you're going into something that is very evocative of horror and twisted and demented. So I had to write a supernatural theme alongside the main theme. The two had to be connected together, and that was one of the biggest practical challenges, technical challenges, of how would I write a supernatural theme that was connected to the original main theme, where the listener could somehow hear a musical connection, but for them to be very different. It's a bit like the Lynchian thing of, if you remember the opening of Blue Velvet, and the film opens up with the front yard of small town America, with the white picket fence, the green grass, a beautiful home, children playing, dogs running around with the water sprinkler, and that's the main theme. And then you dig beneath the surface in the game, and you dig beneath the surface in the opening scene of Blue Velvet, and you go into the dark soil and the earth below the grass, and it's filled with nastiness and insects and bugs, and that's kind of the supernatural theme. Like if you've watched Stranger Things, you've got the upside
Yeah.
down, yeah. So you have the main theme playing, and you have the supernatural, and at any time as the player you might switch instantly into the supernatural theme. And so Sam wanted it to sound, I thought about writing a completely fresh piece of music for the supernatural, but that just wasn't going to work. So I recorded with the orchestra, recorded the main theme and the subverted themes, and then I took the recordings and the stems and started messing around with them in the computer and with plugins, and really slowing things down. And that's where my maths comes in, because a very, very rigid structure. I'm going to slow everything down by 200%, and then start taking out bars of music, an equal number of bars, and then slowing it down again, never randomly, but sort of bringing it down by 400%. So that I'm taking out bars. So when I put it back together again with lots of effects and reverbs and delays and crossfades, it would still match 1-to-1 with the original main theme. And and so if you listen carefully, you can hear fragments of the main theme, but really slowed down and pitched down and twisted. So I would stretch things and pitch them down, and then compress them back together again, so that they were still musically connected to the main theme. That was an interesting challenge.
Yeah, it's so interesting. And, one of the things that also this poses as an interesting, just philosophical challenge for a composer is something that's consistent in Sam's games across all three of the FMV games, is he uses the literal art of filmmaking to make things that are, in a way, decidedly uncinematic. And, obviously this almost voyeuristic surveillance footage, essentially, like not surveillance, but like, documenting. It's like a dash cam almost in her story of just this, tripod mounted police interview camera. And then in Telling Lies, the idea that it's all essentially like Skype, selfie cams on laptops or phones or whatever. Something. So you're using actors on sets and props and costumes, but it's sort of anti-cinematic. And what I thought was so interesting about this one is, I remember he and I had lunch when he came to LA I think he was shooting. And so it was like this was years ago.
Mm-hmm.
It was far from done. He was describing it to me, and I was having the damnedest of a time picturing how this was going to work, because it was just so. He was like, then we zoom in and the player clicks this, and I just remember going, yeah, I don't know what the fuck you're talking about, but I'm sure it'll be very interesting, because it always is. But the thing that I found so fascinating was this time it was, okay, we are going to make actual films. This is no longer selfie style. But then what I love is when I finally go and play the game, he pulls back from that, and we see all those moments. Starts with them slating the shot and calling the take, and you realize it's still this kind of almost anti-cinematic thing where now you're getting a simultaneous insight into the filmmaking process. So you're a viewer of the filmmaking. You're not a viewer of the film, which is, first off, that's just a fascinating way to tell a story, where you're witnessing the actor and the character, and that boundary disappearing between them, and the idea of watching someone try to become their character. And then also, of course, his ability to add commentary on the filmmaking process, and particularly with regard to actresses. And there's all kinds of like additional stuff that lets you tackle as a storyteller. But as a composer, to go, okay, so wait a minute. If I fully embrace how cinematic this is, now I'm almost at odds with the kind of verite, voyeurism into filmmaking. I found that this is one of those challenges where there is no obvious answer. You just have to make a choice. You just have to decide, this is what we're going to do, for better or worse, because it doesn't seem like there could possibly be a definitive approach to how do you score, how do you score a game that is on some level about filmmaking? You know what I mean? It's such a fascinating challenge. I never really saw anything like this before.
Well, I mean, it's the real insight into the human condition, isn't it? Because, I mean, with Telling Lies, Sam was really interested with using mirrors and perspective. And with here, he's kind of using a mirror onto the world of filmmaking through the lens of the behind the scenes. So you've got a story within a story, Right. And it's so multi-layered that, I mean, it's just mind blowing. I didn't go there in that respect. I mean, I find it intriguing, but in the same way, musically, we have a layer within a layer. You've got the external representation of each of those films, and then you've got what's really going on inside Marissa and her existence and her personality and her personal journey, represented by the subverted theme. And then obviously you've got the other manifestation of it as the supernatural theme. So I'm kind of mirroring what's going on in the game on one level, but the way it's implemented is always so fresh. I had no idea. I didn't see any of the filming. In fact, Sam wanted the music done before they filmed. And with Telling Lies in particular, I wrote the music beforehand, and then he would play the characters, he'd play the actors their theme on set. So he would listen to the music on set, and that would and with this as well, the music informed the writing. Be inspired, give me visual ideas, explain scenes to me that would then inspire me. So that's what I find really. I think that with that process, hopefully the music gets imbued in the DNA of the storytelling and the visual aesthetic of the film. And so what I love about this, the cinematography is incredible, and you're using different aspect ratios, you're using different frame rates, you're using the audio quality.
Different cameras even, it felt like.
Cameras, yes, for each of the movies. And so with the music, with the production quality of the music, I worked with the Budapest Arts Orchestra in this instance. But on Telling Lies, I worked with the LCO. And for me, the sound, the texture of, and the sonic quality of the music, and the playing, the way the musicians play their instruments, was as important to me as the actual notes that they were playing as well. To mirror that visual aesthetic of, the different layers and lenses, metaphorical and visual lenses that Sam was using for the various films.
Yeah, that was definitely one of the things I wanted to ask as well, because Rob Ames and the London Contemporary Orchestra is a rather noteworthy ensemble, and obviously very different from, if you're going to London and you do a pickup orchestra is one thing. You can get absolutely phenomenal session musicians. And then, of course, there's the sitting orchestras, the sort of traditional sitting orchestras like the Royal Phil, the London Chamber Orchestra, the Symphony of London, the London Symphony.
Yes.
The Contemporary Orchestra is obviously a bit of an outlier, because their whole MO is, let's try to kind of upset the apple cart a little bit and find new ways of expression. And I think I've never collaborated with them. I worked with Rob recently at this Proms concert, which was our first time kind of directly collaborating, but I've certainly been an admirer of his from afar, not least of which from your collaboration. And I found it interesting because it sort of demands an atypical surrender of the composer's ego to invite him and the orchestra into the process, to kind of really help find the sound in a way that is not our normal way of working. I think you and I are both similar in that when it comes to orchestration, we tend to be pretty exacting. And I think we're also very similar, different results, but very similar way of thinking, of inviting chaos into an otherwise orderly process. Like, I'll never forget the story you told of collaborating with the musician by giving sort of hand signals in real time and letting them essentially pick the notes within a finite set, and not pre-prescribing rhythm, pitch, or anything really. It's found in the moment, but yet you've also constructed it in a way to kind of have guardrails of your making. It's sort of like it's like authoring an AI, where it will do things of its own accord once you've set it loose, but you've also set the outer parameters in which it can operate. I think similarly in collaborating with musicians, and I think you really succeed gloriously in the way that you do this as well. It's fascinating because it really does come through. You can feel the spontaneity that invites. But I'm curious, and especially in the context of a game, I mean, Sam is probably just very atypical, but so much has to be so planned that the world of mock-ups and all that become quite essential. So how do you even reconcile the need for this sort of spontaneity, knowing that the final product is going to have a certain amount of indeterminacy that you simply can't predict, even with something that's as theoretically prescriptive as a traditional orchestra? I don't know if this orchestra in Budapest was comparable to the LCO in this way or not, but I'm kind of asking a multitude of questions in a blurry smorgasbord here. Hopefully it makes sense what I'm driving at. It's just sort of essentially how you manage the process of your collaborators' expectations via mock-ups and things, knowing that your process invites spontaneity even at the exact moment of recording.
Yeah, I know. I think trust. To a certain degree, there's a certain amount of trust.
Inevitably. Certain
collaborators that do trust you, because they know it's going to, in the end, it's always going to work out and the results are going to be, successful, hopefully. But I think it's about creating that framework. So like with Telling Lies, for example, and the LCO, I would do my mock-ups and then get them approved and signed off. And then when it came to the recording stage, we would record exactly what I had written, the notes on the page. And then so that at least I knew there was a fail-safe backup.
That makes total sense.
Yeah. But then to create variety, to create more variations out of the same theme, we then push it to go, okay, let's do 50% semi-improv on this. And so I extended articulation. So I would build time into the recording process to allow for the improvised versions to play around and have time to play around in the recording sessions. So sometimes we wouldn't know quite what we were going to end up with, and having a large ensemble there, or in the studio, was quite nerve-wracking, but also very exciting. And so with Hugh Brunt, who I worked with on Telling Lies, I worked with Rob on a couple of other projects, but with Hugh on Telling Lies, we would do semi-improvisations and again say, okay, let's try changing the notes. Let's try some different extended techniques. Let's try some circular scrubbing and wonderful things like that. And we formed our own language, and that's what the LCO do so well. They've developed their own language to work with, to explain to the musicians, let's try this technique, let's try that technique. And sometimes we'd push it too far, and it just wasn't working within the context of what I knew would work well within the game. But we didn't know that until we actually tried it. So we would push things to the limit, and then we'd go full improv, which would be way off. We'd have our time signature, we'd have our basic structure, but then we'd go full improv, where sometimes things just would be way off the mark. But that then gave me lots of stems to play with. So I would then come back to the studio with a whole bunch of material where I could mix and match semi-improvised material with the versions that I had written, which were note accurate. And so I could change different degrees of, from a 0% to 100%, 0% of no improv to 100% of improv. I could sort of mix and match stems and layers according to, what we'd done and just experimenting with stuff. So that was a lot of fun, but I think, and that's what's so exciting about working with musicians who are open and free thinking. It's like,
and up to the task musically. I mean, that's not an easy thing you're describing, especially on an orchestral level. It's one thing to invite that level of spontaneity from a musician in the safety of, we're here together in this room. It's just us. We can do as many takes as needed.
yes.
When you've got 20, 30, 40, 50 colleagues all doing it, it definitely requires an ensemble that's kind of been built to operate that way from the beginning.
And of course, time is money. When you're in the studio at that level, there's a lot at stake. So that's why I would always play it safe by recording. If as a fail-safe backup, I'd always have my original themes to work with, and then we'd push the boat out and have fun, and building that to experiment. I mean, I love experimenting with soloists in the studio here, and I will bring in, as you described so well, being able to. It's like that experience of working with Daniel Lanoir and sort of Brian Eno, and he's sort of intellectually, he's so good at allowing that space for improvisation to take place and conceptualizing and then being able to communicate that to a musician and making them feel safe and comfortable so that you can go off the wall where there's no right or wrong, and we live, in our industry, generally, I find personally that we live in a culture of fear where you're afraid to go out of the box. And so, which is why so much of what we hear is, it's conformed and, you're writing music that you expect to hear for a certain genre of music, or why we go through phases 100%. Of film scores that all sound like one another and I never blame the composer. I blame this sort of hierarchy and structure of filmmaking where everything costs so much. There's so much at stake. There are so many pressures that audiences don't really understand, why this is. But we know, that it's a challenging industry. It's a business.
Absolutely.
It's a business, and so I think we then champion and relish those freak outliers of creativity, whether they're composers or filmmakers or artists, that can break the mold and create something that then sets a precedent for everyone else to follow for a few years, so yeah, so I think it's trust is at the heart of it, and I think trust and communication with your collaborators is so important, because it gives me as a composer that freedom to think, I'm not doing, if what I like, I would write a theme and I'd send it to Sam and he'd go, yeah, I like this. This is interesting. Or I'm not quite, this is not quite right, because this is not what I hear in my head for this movie. And so I'd develop it and change it and so on. And then I'd park it. And then 6 months later, I'd come back to the same theme and say to Sam, do you know, I know that you signed off on this theme, but I'm not happy with it. Can we have another, can I have another bash at it? Because the person that I was 6 months ago, I am a different person now. And I think I'm in a different frame of mind. When we compose, we're writing based on the time of day and the mood that we're in on that particular
absolutely.
day. And then we'll come back 6 months later and reflect on the work we've done and look back and think, I could have done better. And we don't normally get given that opportunity when we're writing for film and TV. But with games, being on this game for 2.5 years, or whatever it was, it flew by so quickly, and I was always in a rush. but I had the benefit of hindsight and going, actually, I wrote that theme. I think I can do a better representation of religion or of life or of art, of the theme. So that's one of the joys I find of writing music for games, is that, I know it's not always like that, but I just love having that time to experiment and reflect and improve and tweak and experiment.
Well, I think that's one of those where the more I've gotten to know about you and your process, the more you are seemingly such a really natural fit for games, because the time scale does allow for more experimentation than the average film, where you've got weeks to work on it and, maybe months if you're lucky, typically. And games, you could have years to write under an hour of music, which is just so disproportionately out of whack compared to the typical film analogy. But also, to your point about the nature of the business, games are one of the only spots where I think there are plenty that kind of play on the straight and narrow, but there is a hunger for the new and the daring. The market will reward games that are novel and different. You think over the last few years, of course, there was Sam's games, but there was also games like Inside and Limbo, or this last year, or a year ago rather, Inscription. There's games that just fundamentally come onto the scene where you go, I've never really played anything quite like this before. And there's, the novelty can actually drive something to go viral on Twitter or whatever, because people are saying this is unique, and that's good. This actually disrupts. And the funny thing is, I always wonder if we undervalue that novelty, like collectively as an industry in film and TV. Because I remember when, for example, they released the first WandaVision trailer, and it was like, this is a Marvel thing, this 1950s like Dick Van Dyke treatment, and everybody went crazy for it. And I go, it's almost as if new and bold and different and unapologetically odd is something people might like. It's worth taking note, executives of the various powers that be, because that one still really stands apart, from the goings on at the MCU. The MCU has been getting more and more adventurous in certain ways, I think to its benefit, but yeah, the general temperament of kind of being risk averse is for sure a challenge that games has, but to a lesser degree, I would argue. And certainly independent games like Sam's are encouraged. That's the only way to really survive, I would argue, in the marketplace, is to be boldly different. And God knows that his games don't have an issue with being bold and different. So
Yeah.
And you're just such a seemingly perfect match for that. So, well, look, I could kind of peel back layers on this forever and ever and ever. I know it's getting into your afternoon, my late morning here. I can't thank you enough for doing this, and coming on and sharing just endless. There's so many little insights. I can't wait till this goes live. But yeah, in the meantime, hopefully there's like you said, you're working on a new game, and I perked up thinking, ooh, that's exciting. Hopefully that's a thing that comes out this century, because sometimes it's like, oh, I'm working on a game and it's a 2029 release or whatever.
I know.
But fingers crossed that's a thing sooner than later that we get to hear and enjoy.
I've got a couple of games that I'm working on. One much sooner than the other, but they're very, very different from what Sam has created, which is and for me, as I don't do games very often, and so for me it's refreshing, because I'll come at it in my own way, and I'll if I'm writing something conventional, hopefully I can approach it in a way that it's new to me, so hopefully it comes across as being sort of fresh and different, but we'll see. And likewise, I can't wait to see what you come up with next, Austin. Congratulations on the Grammy nomination. A long time coming, and
oh, that's very kind. I'll have you know, I voted for Immortality. I felt it was an absolute no-brainer. I felt it was an injustice to not make the cut. If I'm going to be candid, I honestly, I felt, I'll just air my grievances, as I'm very touched and honored, but I felt yours and the gang of like Alexa and The Flight and Niels and Joris on the Horizon Forbidden West. To me, those two scores, yours and theirs, were two of my favorites for 2022. And I voted for both and was crushingly disappointed that neither. I was like, apparently my taste is very different from everyone else's, which is upsetting. But hey, that's very kind of you. You were in my head canon. We are knives out, fierce competitors for it. But there'll be, the good news with this category is that before long, much the same way that you've enjoyed this recent Emmy win, congratulations to you. The Grammys, I'm sure you will be a regular, as often as you're doing games, you'll be a recurring presence in this category. I've no doubts. So,
well, I hope that we get to hang out.
The next one.
I hope we get to hang out and celebrate the Grammy win or nomination or whatever it is. Soon. In fact, I will be coming to LA soon. So I hope.
Oh, good. Let me know.
I will. Probably January, actually, 2022. So
that is in the past. I'm sorry to inform you.
Sorry, 2023. Where am I? I'm in. Yes. I'm in one of Sam's games. Sorry, I'm flipping.
No, believe me, I will forever think of 20 years ago as the 80s, and the last 10 years was the 90s. Like, my brain seems to be permanently parked somewhere around the year 2000 for some reason. 30 years ago feels like the 70s. I don't know why I can't seem to, like, the idea that 2020, the idea that 2000 was 22 years ago is, my brain just stubbornly can't onboard as a fact.
Terrifying.
So
yeah.
It's so yes, whatever January is forthcoming, hopefully I will see you here. We'll have a coffee.
Thank you, Austin.